The Aston Martin sat perfectly still in the center bay of Meridian Motor Group's flagship garage, its dark green paint catching the overhead halogen lights like the surface of a frozen lake. It was worth more than most people earned in a decade, a rare, limited production model that the owner, a man named Gerald Whitmore, had flown in from across the country specifically for this facility. The car had died without warning after routine maintenance at another shop. And now, 3 weeks later, it had become the most expensive, unsolved puzzle in the city. 6 specialists had been brought in, not ordinary mechanics, credentialed engineers, factory-certified diagnosticians, the kind of people whose hourly rate made accountants wince. Together, they had run the car through every diagnostic protocol available, replaced the engine control unit, swapped sensors, tested wiring harnesses, checked fuel pressure, and ordered components overnight from international suppliers. The invoices stacked up to more than $25,000. The car still would not start. Every morning, Meridian's owner, a broad-shouldered man named Dennis Halverson, walked into the garage and looked at the Aston Martin the way a man looks at a slow-burning fire he cannot put out. His reputation had taken a quiet hit. Clients whispered. Partners asked uncomfortable questions, and the car sat there, silent and indifferent, like a verdict that had already been decided. The team that Dennis had assembled was led by a 32-year-old diagnostic specialist named Rachel Calloway. She had arrived from a consulting firm in Chicago with 2 certifications, a portfolio of high-profile repairs, and the kind of measured confidence that fills a room before a person finishes walking into it. Rachel had never failed to resolve a case, and she made sure everyone around her knew it, not through bragging, exactly, but through a specific kind of tone, the tone of someone who has already concluded that all other options are inferior. She wore her authority visibly, moved quickly through the workspace, and spoke in declarative sentences that left little room for questions. The other 5 engineers worked around her like planets in careful orbit, deferring to her readings and her diagnoses without much pushback. When the first ECU swap didn't work, she attributed it to a secondary fault. When the second round of component replacements failed, she cited unusual electrical interference. There was always a next step. There was always a reason. She had not yet used the word stumped, and it seemed like she did not intend to. In the far corner of the garage, a man named Walter Briggs pushed a wide mop in slow, even strokes across the polished concrete floor. He was 38 years old, compact and unhurried, with the kind of quiet face that people describe later as calm, though at the time they usually just don't notice it. Walter had worked at Meridian Motor Group for 14 months. He arrived early, did his job without complaint, and left without drawing attention. He knew where every drain was located, which drains backed up in winter, which bay had the ventilation problem that nobody had filed a work order for yet. He knew the cars, too. He always had, though nobody had ever asked him about that. While the team of specialists ran cables and read error codes, Walter moved his mop around the edges of their activity, like water finding its level. No one looked at him. No one needed to. It was on the 7th day of the team's work that Walter first stopped at the corner of Bay 3 and looked at the Aston Martin with something more than passing attention. He stood still long enough that a young technician named Brandon, barely 23, and still in his first year at Meridian, noticed him and slowed down. Brandon had a habit of noticing things that more experienced people had stopped seeing. He watched Walter tilt his head slightly to the left, the way a person does when a sound is not quite right, though the car was silent. "You know this model?" Brandon asked, with the easy curiosity of someone who had not yet learned to rank people before speaking to them. Walter looked at him without turning his head away from the car. "A little," he said. Brandon pressed further. "You ever work on one?" Walter was quiet for a moment. "A long time ago," he said. Then he picked up his mop and moved on. Brandon watched him go with the feeling that something slightly important had just happened, though he couldn't have said what. The exchange was overheard. Rachel Calloway had sharp ears, and she processed ambient information the way some people process ambient sound quickly, efficiently, and with immediate categorization. She turned from the diagnostic terminal where she had been reviewing the morning's data, looked at Walter's retreating figure, and allowed a brief, dry smile to cross her face. "I love that," she said to no one in particular, her voice just loud enough for the room. "Everyone's a mechanic when they've read the right article." Two of the engineers chuckled. A third looked briefly uncomfortable and said nothing. Brandon opened his mouth and then closed it again. Walter continued mopping and did not look back. But something in the bay had shifted, the kind of shift that does not register until later. When a person replays the moment and realizes that something small and irreversible had just occurred. Later that afternoon, while the team took a break in the back room and Rachel filled out paperwork at her portable workstation, Walter was alone in Bay 3. He moved his cleaning cart past the Aston Martin slowly. And then he stopped. He stood beside the open engine bay. The specialists had left the hood raised, and he looked into it with a stillness that was almost ceremonial. He did not touch anything. He did not pull out a phone. He simply looked, reading the engine, the way a person reads a familiar book, not hunting for anything specific, just letting the knowledge surface on its own. His eyes moved from the intake manifold to the fuel rail, then down toward the firewall, and then stopped. Something was not right. It was subtle, the kind of thing that required knowing not just where parts were supposed to be, but how they had been put there, in what sequence, and with what intention. Walter saw it the way a person sees a word misspelled by one letter. Not immediately, not obviously, but undeniably once your eye finds it. He straightened up. He pushed his cart forward, and very quietly, almost to himself, he said, "It's not an electrical problem. No one heard him." Or rather, no one responded. But the words were accurate, and they hung in the air of Bay 3 for a moment before the ventilation system carried them away. The following week was a study in institutional pressure. Gerald Whitmore had called Dennis Halverson twice, and both calls had ended with thinly veiled threats about legal consultation and damage to the vehicle's value through unnecessary component replacement. Dennis had absorbed these calls with the practiced stoicism of a man who had built a business on absorbing bad news, but the weight was accumulating. He had taken to standing in the bay door in the mornings, coffee in hand, watching the team work with the expression of a man who has begun to suspect that watching and hoping are the same thing. Rachel, for her part, had not changed her approach. She had ordered 3 additional components from 2 different suppliers, written a 7-page diagnostic report that found no fewer than 14 potential contributing causes, and presented it to Dennis with the confidence of someone who does not yet understand that confidence and competence are not synonyms. The other engineers were beginning to quietly disagree with her, which they expressed in the careful language of people who depend on a professional relationship. Softened suggestions, half questions, a habit of looking at each other for a half-second too long after she spoke. A senior technician named Marcus, who had 15 years of European vehicle experience and a quiet reputation for being right about hard cases, had started spending more time with his arms folded and less time with his hands on the car. He had tried twice to suggest that the fuel delivery system deserved more physical examination rather than electronic diagnosis. And twice, Rachel had redirected the conversation toward the vehicle's software architecture. The second time, Marcus had stopped pushing. Some arguments were not about the argument. It was during this period that an older service advisor named Frank, who had been at Meridian for 19 years and had forgotten more about the garage than most people ever learned, stopped Walter in the hallway near the parts storage room and looked at him with an expression that Walter could not quite classify. Frank was a man of careful economy, the kind who did not speak unless the information had somewhere specific to go. He looked at Walter for a long moment and then said, quietly, "You worked at Carrington Performance, the engine division. It was not a question." Walter met his eyes and said nothing. Frank nodded slowly, as if receiving confirmation of something he had already decided. 19 years ago, Frank said, mostly to himself, "You were the one who built the variable cam timing system for the GT prototype." Walter looked at him steadily. "I used to do a lot of things," he said. Frank was quiet for a moment. "Then those people in Bay 3, he said, are about to have a very bad day." He walked away without waiting for a response. And Walter watched him go, and then went back to his work. By the end of the third week, the situation had reached a kind of critical mass. Gerald Whitmore arrived at Meridian in person, which was not something he had done before. He was 61 years old, wore his wealth the way old money does without display, just presence, and he stood in Bay 3 and looked at his car for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at Dennis and said, with the precision of a man who had run companies for 30 years, "I want it moved." The room went cold. Dennis asked for more time. Gerald gave him 48 hours, the way judges give sentences without negotiation, without softness. Rachel, standing at the edge of the conversation, said, "We're very close. I'm confident we'll identify the source." Gerald looked at her for 3 seconds, not long, but the kind of 3 seconds that carries its own specific message, and then he looked away without responding. It was, in its own quiet way, one of the most devastating rejections in the room's recent history. Rachel, to her credit, did not show the wound. She turned back to her team and spoke with the same declarative certainty. But something in the room's atmosphere had changed. The other engineers were no longer merely uncertain, they were beginning to detach, the way professionals do when they sense that a project is about to fail, and they want to be clearly on record as having had reservations. Marcus had written 3 emails in the past 2 days to the team's collective thread, each one carefully worded, each one documenting a suggestion that had not been taken. He was building a paper trail. In that sense, at least, he was preparing for the right outcome, just not in time to produce it. Walter was at the end of his shift when the conversation in Bay 3 reached its lowest point. He had been cleaning the hallway adjacent to the bay, and through the open partition he had heard the exchange with Gerald Whitmore, the team's murmured conversation afterward, and Rachel's increasingly brittle reassurances. He had not meant to stop at the bay entrance. He had not planned what he said next. He was carrying his mop and looking at the Aston Martin, and the words came out with the same unhurried certainty as everything else about him. "I think it might be the mechanical fuel delivery. Not the injectors, the line routing coming off the secondary rail." The silence that followed was approximately 2 seconds long. Then Rachel turned around. She looked at Walter, the way certain people look at things that have appeared where they should not be. Not anger, exactly, but a specific kind of offense. The offense of a category being violated. "I'm sorry," she said. Walter held her gaze. "After the ECU was replaced," he said, "the fuel line from the secondary rail. I think it was reinstalled with a kink in the routing. Low pressure at idle, no start." The room was still for another beat. Then Rachel laughed. It was a short, clean, professional laugh. The kind designed to dismiss without cruelty, to return the room to its proper order. "Sir," she said. And the word carried the full weight of its intended distance. "Do you want to tell us what your diagnostic certification is?" A couple of the engineers looked at their hands. Brandon was looking directly at Walter. Marcus had gone very still. "I don't have one," Walter said simply. Rachel spread her hands in a small gesture of resolution. Then, with all due respect, she said, "Let's let the people who do have one handle the diagnosis." She said it pleasantly, which made it worse. "You clean floors and I fix engines," she added, softer, but loud enough. "That's how this works." Walter looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded and pushed his cart toward the exit. Rachel turned back to her team. The bay resumed its noise. Brandon watched Walter leave and felt something cold settle in the pit of his stomach that he couldn't name yet. The 48 hours Gerald Whitmore had given them passed with the speed that deadline hours always pass too fast in the beginning. Unbearable at the end. By the morning of the second day, nothing had changed. The Aston Martin sat immovable. Rachel had tried 2 more approaches, both methodical, both informed by the diagnostic data, and both without result. She had stopped explaining her reasoning aloud, which was its own kind of signal. The team worked in a silence that had texture to it, the specific silence of people who have stopped believing in the project but have not yet said so. Dennis Halverson had aged visibly. He stood in the bay less now, which meant he had nothing left to supervise. He was waiting for the verdict. It was 20 minutes before the end of Walter's shift when he stopped at the entrance of Bay 3 one last time. He had his jacket over his arm. He stood at the edge of the bay for a moment, looking at the car, and then he looked at Dennis, who was standing with his back to the far wall with his arms crossed. Something passed between them that was not words, a kind of mutual recognition of the situation's weight. Then Walter said, "Give me 5 minutes." The bay went quiet. Then someone exhaled. And then someone else made a sound that was halfway between a cough and a laugh. And then Rachel turned from the diagnostic terminal and looked at him with an expression that had moved past dismissal into something closer to disbelief. "You are serious," she said, not as a question. 5 minutes, Walter said again, to Dennis. Dennis looked at him. Dennis had been in business long enough to know that desperation has its own logic. And the logic now was simple. Nothing else had worked, and the car was leaving in 20 minutes regardless. He nodded once. What happened next was, to anyone watching, deeply strange. Walter set his jacket on a clean section of workbench, moved to the left side of the engine bay, and without any equipment beyond a small flashlight and a standard ratchet from his back pocket, began to work. He did not consult the car's service manual. He did not connect anything to the OBD port. He moved through the engine bay the way a person moves through a familiar house, in the dark, not hesitantly, not quickly, but with the absolute confidence of someone who has made this specific journey before. He bent low and angled the flashlight into the secondary fuel rail area, looking at the line routing, tracing it with one finger without touching it. His lips moved slightly, though no sound came out. Then he took the ratchet, reached in past 2 sets of components, and made 3 adjustments slow, controlled, each one deliberate. There were no dramatic sounds, no snapping of damaged parts, just the small, clean click of a fitting being corrected to where it had always wanted to be. The garage was completely silent. Every person in Bay 3 had stopped what they were doing. Rachel was standing with her arms at her sides. Marcus had his eyes fixed on the engine bay. Brandon had his hand over his mouth. Even the service advisors who had wandered in from adjacent bays had gone still, drawn by the specific silence of a moment that everyone present understood was significant without being able to say, why. Walter straightened up. He looked at the engine for a moment. Then he took a piece of shop rag from his back pocket, wiped his hands slowly and carefully, folded the rag, and set it on the workbench. He looked at Dennis. "Start it," he said. Dennis crossed the bay to the driver's door. He reached in, pressed the start button, and the Aston Martin's engine turned over once, twice, and then caught, and roared. Not tentatively, not with the hesitation of a machine in uncertain health, but fully and immediately, with the deep, confident authority of an engine that had been waiting for exactly this. The sound filled the garage completely. It was the loudest silence anyone in that room had ever heard broken. A wrench hit the concrete floor somewhere in the back, and the sound rang out like a punctuation mark. Somewhere above the engine noise, someone said something that was not quite a word. Gerald Whitmore, who had arrived early and was standing near the bay door, put both hands flat on the roof of the car, the way a person puts their hands on something to confirm it is real. The engine ran smooth and even, without flutter, without hesitation, the way it had been built to run. 3 weeks of failure resolved in 4 minutes and 40 seconds. Rachel Calloway said, "That's not possible." She said it quietly, almost privately, and it was not an argument, it was the sound of a person's internal model of the world making an involuntary correction. Walter looked at her without expression. "The line from the secondary rail had a tight kink at the bracket," he said. "Your team reinstalled it after the ECU swap. Slight restriction at idle, not enough pressure to fire the injectors, but it didn't show clearly on the data because the kink was partially self-correcting at higher simulation pressures." He paused. "The machine gave you accurate data about what it was measuring. It just wasn't measuring the right thing." Rachel's mouth opened and then closed. Walter picked up his jacket from the workbench. "Machines give you data," he said, Experience gives you the question to ask. He said it without drama, without emphasis, without any of the theatrical weight of someone delivering a significant line. He said it the way a person states a fact about weather. Then he walked toward the exit. The investigation that followed took less time than the repair. Dennis had the entire 3-week work log reviewed by Marcus and 2 other senior technicians who were now, very suddenly, very willing to be thorough. What they found was straightforward. 7 individual components had been replaced unnecessarily, 4 of which were either undamaged or had been damaged in the process of removal. The total cost of parts and labor that had contributed nothing to the resolution of the problem amounted to just over $22,000. Rachel's team had been solving the wrong problem thoroughly, professionally, and expensively for 21 days. The fuel line kink that Walter had identified and corrected had been introduced on the 4th day of the team's work, when the ECU replacement required moving several components in the engine bay. It had been a simple installation error, the kind that happens when attention is on the complex task and not the adjacent one. It had not been visible on any electronic diagnostic, because no electronic diagnostic had been designed to detect mechanical misrouting by visual inspection. It required someone to look with their eyes and to know what they were looking at. Rachel tried twice to redirect the narrative, once toward the complexity of the vehicle's architecture, and once toward the incomplete documentation provided by the previous shop. Both attempts dissolved on contact with the work log, which was detailed, factual, and indifferent to interpretation. Marcus, who had said little for 2 weeks, said a great deal in the hour following. Dennis listened with the face of a man doing financial calculations in his head that were not going well. Gerald Whitmore sat in a chair near the bay door and said nothing at all, which was more than sufficient. 2 of Rachel's team members were already making calls to their agency. The situation had the specific and unmistakable quality of a structure that has already collapsed and is only now registering the fact. Brandon stood at the edge of everything and watched and understood that he was seeing something he would remember for a long time. Gerald Whitmore stood up from his chair and walked to where Walter was beginning to gather the last of his cleaning equipment in preparation for leaving. He stood in front of Walter with the directness of a man who had not gotten to where he was by being indirect, and he said, "I've seen your name before." Walter looked at him. "There was a piece," Gerald said, "in an engineering trade publication. It must have been 15 years ago, maybe 16. About the Carrington Performance GT project, the variable cam timing system that won the design award." He paused. The engineer's name was Walter Briggs. Walter held his gaze and said nothing. Gerald nodded slowly. "I kept that article," he said. "I thought it was the kind of engineering that didn't happen very often." The bay had gone very quiet. Dennis was listening. Marcus was listening. Brandon was listening so hard, he had forgotten to breathe. Rachel Calloway stood 12 feet away and looked at Walter with an expression that no one in the room had seen on her face before, the expression of someone who has just understood the specific dimensions of a mistake they cannot correct. The story that Frank had known in fragments, that Dennis had not known at all, and that Brandon had only suspected, came into the bay now through Gerald's careful telling and through the silences that Walter allowed, rather than filling. 15 years earlier, Walter Briggs had been among the most respected mechanical engineers in the performance automotive industry. He had come up through practical training rather than formal education, spending his early 20s in independent shops and custom-built houses, developing the diagnostic intuition that cannot be taught in classrooms, because it lives in hands and ears and the accumulated library of 10,000 hours of physical problem-solving. He had joined Carrington Performance at 26 and built a reputation over 7 years for the specific and unusual skill of resolving failures that had defeated everyone else. His variable cam timing system had been the engineering highlight of his career, designed entirely by hand calculation, without computer-aided modeling, and proven right by a prototype that had run without modification for 80,000 miles. He had been profiled, consulted, and recruited. At 31, he had been offered the chief engineering position at 3 separate firms. He had turned them all down. Not because he didn't care, but because something happened that made the career irrelevant. His wife had become ill, seriously, suddenly, without warning, and the illness was long and expensive and consuming in the way that real crises consume everything that is not essential. Walter had spent 2 years as a caregiver, working smaller and smaller jobs as his other obligations required. When she recovered, he found that the world he had been part of had reorganized itself in his absence, that the professional networks had closed slightly, that the industry had developed new tools he had not been present to learn, and that the hunger he had once had for recognition had been replaced by something quieter and harder to name. He did not go back. He found other work, each position simpler than the last, each one further from the world that had once wanted him. He did not do this from defeat. He did it from a kind of deliberate choice that some people make after surviving a serious thing, the choice to live smaller and closer to the ground, where the wind does not reach. Dennis Halverson asked him, with the careful formality of a man making an offer he means seriously, whether he would consider returning to mechanical engineering in a formal capacity. Meridian needed a chief diagnostician. The position paid well. The facility was excellent. Walter listened to the offer, with the same quality of attention he gave to everything, complete, unhurried, without any performance of consideration. Then he said, "That's very kind." And then he said, "No." Dennis waited, in case there was more. There wasn't. Rachel Calloway was watching Walter from across the bay. She had not spoken in 20 minutes. The expression on her face was not dramatic. There was no tears, no visible collapse. It was something more precise. The specific look of a person who is intelligent enough to understand exactly what has happened and what it means, and who does not yet know what to do with that understanding. She had spent 10 years building a professional identity on the premise that credentialed expertise was the highest form of knowledge. She had believed this not cynically but genuinely. The way people believe things that their entire professional environment confirms. She had dismissed Walter not out of cruelty, but out of a worldview, and the worldview had just been surgically, quietly, and completely dismantled by a man with a shop rag and a standard ratchet. She walked toward him. Walter saw her coming and waited. She stopped a few feet away and looked at him, and when she spoke, her voice had lost the declarative quality it usually carried. "Who are you?" she said. It was not exactly a question. It was more like a statement that had not yet found its form. Walter looked at her for a moment. "Walter," he said. She waited, clearly expecting more. He offered nothing additional. She said, "Why didn't you say something earlier?" "When you knew?" Walter considered this with the same evenness he brought to everything. "I did," he said. She looked away. She looked back. "I should have listened," she said. It cost her something to say it that was visible, and Walter did not make it worse. "You have good instincts," he told her. And the evenness in his voice made it clear this was not consolation but fact. The diagnostic approach was technically correct. The problem was assuming the data was complete. He picked up his jacket. "It almost never is," he said. Rachel Calloway was suspended from the consulting firm's active roster, pending an internal review. The language of her suspension was professional and anodyne. But the substance was clear. A major assignment had failed. A client had been significantly overcharged, and the cause had been identified as diagnostic overconfidence, combined with a failure to integrate non-electronic examination. She sat in her car in Meridian's parking lot for 20 minutes after her exit conversation with Dennis, not doing anything. Just sitting in the particular stillness of a person who has had a load-bearing belief removed and has not yet rebuilt around its absence. She was not broken, that was not quite the right word. But she was changed. The professional certainty she had carried into every room for 10 years had a new qualification attached to it. One she had not chosen and could not remove. And she would be learning its dimensions for a long time. Dennis Halverson offered Gerald Whitmore a full refund of the diagnostic fees and a significant reduction on future service. Gerald accepted the terms without discussion and shook Dennis's hand with the directness of someone who had gotten what he actually came for, which was not money but resolution. He walked past the Aston Martin on his way out and put his hand on the roof again briefly, almost privately, and then he left. The engine, which Brandon had left idling at Gerald's request, continued to run. It ran the way a well-made thing runs when it has finally been allowed to do what it was designed to do, without effort, without performance, simply and fully itself. Brandon found Walter near the end of the day, in the supply room off the main corridor, refilling a cleaning cart. He stood in the doorway for a moment with the air of someone who has been composing a question for several hours. Walter looked at him and waited. Brandon said, "How did you know where to look? When everyone else missed it?" Walter straightened up from the supply cabinet and thought about this in the way he thought about things, not performing the thinking, but actually doing it. "I made that same mistake once," he said, 30 years ago. I'd replaced a major component, and I was so focused on whether I'd done the replacement right that I didn't check what had moved while I was doing it. Car didn't start. Took me 3 days to find what I'd done. He set a bottle on the cart. I never forgot what it looked like. Brandon nodded slowly, absorbing this. "So you just remembered?" Walter looked at him. "Mistakes are expensive," he said. "If you pay attention when you make them, they're worth what they cost." Brandon thought about that for a moment. "Is that why you didn't say more?" "When she laughed at you," Walter picked up the handle of his cart. "Saying more wouldn't have changed her mind," he said. "The car was going to say it better than I could." He pushed the cart toward the exit. "It did," Brandon said quietly, almost to himself. Walter paused at the door. He looked back at Brandon with something in his expression that was not quite a smile, but was close to the warmth that comes before one. "You're going to be good at this," he said. Then he walked out into the corridor, and the soft rolling sound of the cart's wheels moved steadily down the hall and faded. In the days that followed, something settled permanently in Bay 3 at Meridian Motor Group. The physical space was the same. The cars came and went. The diagnostics ran, and the invoices printed, and the work orders cycled through the system the same as always. But among the people who had been present, Marcus, Brandon, Frank, and the others who had stood in silence and watched, there was a new habit of looking. Not just at screens, not just at readouts, a habit of asking, what did we move when we weren't watching ourselves? What did we assume the data was covering that it wasn't? It was not a dramatic change. It did not announce itself. It was the kind of change that lives in the hands and the eyes, in the small hesitation before assumption, in the extra minute spent looking at the physical thing rather than the representation of it. Walter continued to arrive at his regular hour, do his work, and leave. He was not different than he had been, which was itself a kind of statement. The treatment he received was different. People stepped aside when he passed through a bay. Not performatively, not with the exaggerated deference of people overcompensating for a previous wrong, but with the natural courtesy extended to someone whose presence has weight. Conversations quieted slightly when he was near. Young technicians watched him move through a space, the way people watch someone who carries expertise, the way some people carry grief completely, quietly, not as a thing they perform, but as a thing they simply are. He accepted none of this with satisfaction, and none of it with discomfort. He accepted it the way he accepted everything, by continuing to do what he had been doing, which was work. The Aston Martin left Meridian Motor Group on a Tuesday morning, on the back of a covered transport arranged by Gerald Whitmore's office. Before it was loaded, Dennis had it brought to the front of the facility and photographed, not for promotional purposes, but because he felt some instinct to document the resolution of something that had been, for 3 weeks, unresolvable. The photograph showed the car in morning light, its dark green paint composed and still, the engine bay closed, everything in its correct place. It was, to look at it, a perfectly ordinary car, which was, in its own way, the point. There are people who carry their expertise like a credential displayed, maintained, renewed, presented as proof. And there are people who carry it differently. The way knowledge gets carried when it has been earned through error rather than through study. When it has been tested against real failure in real time, when it has been paid for with something personal. These two kinds of people can work in the same room for weeks and never quite speak the same language. The credential carriers have something to prove, which means they have something to protect, which means they have something to lose. The others, the ones who have already lost and rebuilt and come out the other side quieter, they have nothing to prove. And that is the most dangerous thing in any room, because the people with nothing to prove are the ones who can afford to see clearly. Walter Briggs came back the next morning, the morning after the Aston Martin left, and began his shift as he always did, moving through the facility in the unhurried way of someone who has exactly as much time as the job requires. He stopped at the entrance of Bay 3 and looked in, the same way he had looked in for 14 months, and saw the space without the car in it for the first time in 3 weeks. It looked right. He pushed his cart inside and began. The overhead lights hummed. The concrete was clean and cool beneath his feet. He worked steadily, without noise. The way a person works when the work is the whole thing, when there is no audience required, no acknowledgement needed, no gap between the doing of it and the reason for doing it. Just the work. Just the floor. Just the long, even pull of the mop through the light. And if anyone had been watching, really watching, the way Brandon had learned to watch, with the kind of attention that does not sort things before it sees them, they might have noticed the way Walter moved through that space, and understood that some people show you everything they are the first time you look, but only if you have already learned how to look. Most people take longer than 3 weeks. Some people never get there, but on a Tuesday morning in a high-end garage, in a city that does not particularly reward patience, the lesson had been paid for in full, at a cost of $25,000 and a great deal of professional humility, by people who had believed that instruments made looking unnecessary. The floor was clean. The engine ran, and the man who had known what was wrong from the beginning went on about his work, as if none of it had mattered, which was exactly the thing that made it matter most. The weeks after Rachel Calloway's departure from the project left a particular kind of residue in Meridian Motor Group, the kind that settles into a workplace the way weather settles into a season, slowly and without announcement, until one day you notice that the temperature has changed. Dennis Halverson had been in the automotive business long enough to understand that reputation is the only inventory that cannot be restocked from a supplier. What had happened in Bay 3 had cost him money, certainly, but money was repairable. What it had nearly cost him was something harder to replace. The quiet confidence of his clients, the unspoken belief that when they brought something precious to his facility, it would be treated with the full measure of competence the facility's name implied. He had come closer to losing that than he had ever come before, and he knew, with the particular clarity that near misses produce, that he had been saved not by his own system, but by a man whose name had not appeared on a single professional credential hanging on his walls. He thought about this more than he admitted. In the mornings before the bays filled with work and the noise of the day absorbed his attention, he found himself reviewing the timeline of those 3 weeks with the deliberate honesty of a man conducting his own audit. He had seen Walter in Bay 3 on the 4th day. He had seen him on the 8th day, standing near the engine. He had been present when Walter made his suggestion about the fuel delivery system, and he had said nothing not to validate the suggestion, not to ask for more. Just silence, the silence of a man who had categorized the speaker before hearing the content. He had let Rachel's laugh close the door, and the door had stayed closed for another 10 days while the invoices climbed. Dennis was not a man who enjoyed self-reproach, but he believed in paying accurate debts, and this particular debt needed to be acknowledged clearly before he could move forward from it. He sought Walter out near the end of the 2nd week after the resolution, finding him in the East Corridor restocking supply shelves with the same unhurried efficiency he brought to everything. Dennis stood beside him and for a moment said nothing, which was its own form of communication. Then he said, "I should have listened when you spoke up." The first time, Walter stacked a bottle on the shelf and did not turn immediately. "You didn't have a reason to," he said, without any particular emphasis on either word. Dennis looked at the floor for a moment. "I had the same reason I always have," he said, "which is that I'm paying to fix a car, not to verify someone's credentials." He paused. I lost sight of that. Walter turned and looked at him with the steady, level gaze that had characterized every significant moment of the past 3 weeks. "It's easy to lose sight of," he said. That was the whole of the conversation. It was, in its own abbreviated way, complete. Marcus had his own reckoning, conducted without an audience, and lasting considerably longer. He had known, on some level, that the diagnostic approach was producing diminishing returns. He had felt the discomfort of a professional who suspects the project has gone sideways but lacks the authority or the will to change its course. He had filed his emails, documented his concerns, and called it responsibility. But Walter had done the thing Marcus had not done, which was say the uncomfortable thing out loud, in a room where it would not be welcome, without the protection of professional authority, without the safety of peer support, and without any expectation that it would be received. Marcus had had all three of those things, and had still stayed quiet when it mattered. He would carry that particular piece of knowledge about himself for longer than the professional situation required, because it said something about him that was more personal than professional, and he knew it. Brandon, whose trajectory was still in its early arc, absorbed everything differently the way young people absorb formative experiences, not as events to analyze, but as material from which their future selves are being quietly built. He had been watching Walter since the day of their first brief conversation. And what he had watched was a specific kind of person, demonstrating a specific kind of intelligence, the intelligence of someone who has failed publicly, recovered privately, and emerged on the other side with their judgment intact. He had watched the humiliation in Bay 3, the laughter, the dismissal, the public reduction of a man to his job title, and he had watched Walter absorb it without deflection and without surrender, and continue working. That was the image Brandon returned to in the following weeks. Not the triumph of the engine roaring to life, which was spectacular but brief, but the earlier image, Walter turning away from the laughter with no visible change in his expression, pushing his cart toward the exit, disappearing into the ordinary business of the day. That was the harder thing. That was the thing Brandon wanted to understand. He asked Walter about it directly one afternoon, the kind of directness that youth allows before professional decorum teaches people to approach things obliquely. "Doesn't it bother you?" he said. "When people talk to you like that?" Walter was filling a spray bottle at the utility sink, and he considered the question without hurrying toward an answer. "Like what?" he said. Though his tone made clear, he understood the reference. Brandon said, "Like you're nobody." Walter let the bottle fill for a moment. He turned off the tap and capped the bottle and set it on the cart. "I am nobody," he said, "until I'm not." Brandon waited. "Which means," Walter continued, "that most of the time, the conversation isn't worth having. And sometimes, the situation makes the argument for you, and you don't have to say a word." He picked up the cart handle. "That's a more comfortable way to live than needing everyone to know what you know all the time." He moved toward the door and then stopped and looked back. "That woman needed everyone to know what she knew all the time," he said. "That's why she couldn't hear anything." Then he left, and Brandon stood at the utility sink with the feeling of someone who has just received a piece of information that is going to mean more as time goes on. Rachel Calloway left the city within a month. The consulting firm had placed her on administrative leave pending review, and the review had arrived at a conclusion that was professionally survivable but personally devastating, in the way that public professional failures always are not, because of what they take from you immediately, but because of what they take from your internal story about yourself. Rachel had built her professional life on a foundation she believed was solid, and the foundation had not failed. The engineering knowledge was real. The certifications were legitimate. The hundreds of previous successful jobs were not retroactively canceled. But the knowledge had a gap in it that she had not known was there. The gap between what instruments can measure and what experience can see, and the gap had been demonstrated to her in the most public and expensive way possible. She could survive that. People survived harder things, but it was going to require a significant and uncomfortable revision of who she understood herself to be. She called Dennis 2 weeks after her departure, from a number he didn't recognize, and he took the call because something in him suspected who it was. She asked him for Walter's contact information. Dennis told her he would pass her number along and leave it to Walter to decide, which was the correct answer and which Rachel understood as such. She thanked him and ended the call. Dennis gave Walter the number the following day, written on a strip of paper torn from a work order form, and Walter took it and put it in his pocket and said nothing. Whether he called Dennis never asked and never knew. Some things are not institutional. The Aston Martin story, as stories will, circulated. It moved through the automotive service community in the oblique, word-of-mouth way that industry stories travel, picking up detail and shedding detail in roughly equal measure, becoming slightly more dramatic with each retelling, and slightly less precise. The core of it held. A specialist team had failed, a custodian had succeeded, the car was worth more than most people's houses, and the fix had taken less time than the average lunch break. People who heard it laughed at first, because that is the natural response to a story shaped like a reversal. Then some of them stopped laughing and thought about it, because the best reversals are not just entertaining, they point at something. This one pointed at something most professionals had felt at some point. The creeping unease of wondering whether the tools had become more real to them than the thing the tools were measuring, whether the data had quietly replaced the understanding, whether expertise had become, somewhere along the way, a reason not to look. Frank, who had known the story before it was a story, said nothing when the tellings reached him. He had 19 years of mechanical experience and 12 years of watching people, and he understood that the thing most worth saying about Walter Briggs was not what had happened in Bay 3, which was, in the end, a competent man doing a competent thing, but what Walter had been doing for 14 months before it. He had been showing up. He had been doing exactly what the job required and nothing more, living in the small space his choices had assigned him, not resisting it and not resenting it, and carrying his full self inside that small space without display. That was not a story that makes for good retelling. There is no drama in the long middle of it. No moment of revelation. No satisfying reversal. It is just a man at work, day after day, being more than anyone sees. Frank thought about this occasionally while closing up the facility at night, walking through the quiet bays with the lights going off behind him. It was the kind of thought that doesn't resolve, that just stays with you, clarifying slowly. The floor was clean. It was always clean. That had been true before anyone understood why it mattered, and it remained true after. The mop moved in its slow, even strokes across the concrete, and the overhead lights reflected in the polished surface, and the bays held their cars, and the cars waited for the diagnosis that would return them to motion. Some of them would be helped by machines. Some of them would be helped by people who had learned what machines could not yet measure. And on the days when the two were confused for each other, the cost was paid in time and money, and the particular humiliation of discovering that what you were most certain of was the thing most worth questioning. That lesson cost $25,000 in one specific garage, in one specific city, delivered by a man with a mop and 30 years of irreplaceable knowledge living quietly behind his eyes, going about his work as if nothing had happened. Because he had already lived the full version of the story, including the part that hurt nothing particularly surprising had. There are people who look ordinary until they begin to do the thing they are best at. The rest of the time, they simply exist among us, unremarkable and unhurried, carrying what they know the way a deep river carries its weight without surface disturbance, without announcement, just the steady and irresistible movement of something that has somewhere real to go.